Hello, everybody. I'm going to let Akam introduce the webinar today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akam Rahman, and I'm the Operations Branch Chief for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Service in the Administration for Children and Families. On behalf of Division, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on completing the fiscal year 2024 performance measures, which is Module 2 of the fiscal year 2024 Performance Data Form. Today's webinars has 3 speakers. First of all, Melissa Torgerson of Verb Associates. She is a former LIHEAP coordinator for Oregon, and she works regularly to assist grant recipients with in-depth technical assistance. Next, we have Dan Bosch of Apprise. He has more than 10 years of experience conducting LIHEAP report training and review. And finally, Brian Moore. He is the director of Pennsylvania's LIHEAP program. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will focus on the key items needed to complete the fiscal year 2024 performance measures, which is due in the Online Data Collection System, or OLDC, on January 31st of 2025. Yesterday, we published and shared the action transmittal with our state grant recipients, and we also emailed that information to all of the relevant grant recipients. For today, the purpose of the webinar are to review the key requirements for completing the fiscal year 2024 performance measures, to review the data you need to successfully complete the report, and to explain the process for submitting the report in the OLDC system. The audience for today's webinar is state LIHEAP coordinators and program staff that assist with completing the performance measures. If you or your staff are unable to attend, or you want to hear the training again, a recording will be made available on the ACF YouTube channel. We greatly appreciate you joining us today and hope today's webinar is valuable to you. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you, Akam, and welcome everyone to today's webinar about the Module 2 of the Performance Data Form and performance measures. Today's webinar is going to be about 60 minutes long. The slides, the template, and everything, as Akam said, is available for download in the GoToWebinar sidebar. And if you can't see the GoToWebinar sidebar, what you can do is click the little orange arrow, or it might be a different color on your computer, and it will maximize. And what this will also do is show you the question box. Now, if you have questions that you came with, or if you have them throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type them in the question box in the sidebar, and we'll review all of these questions and respond at the end of the webinar. If we don't have time to answer your questions, we will email you directly. Next slide, please. So if you've been to one of our webinars before, you know that we like to give you a little bit of an outline. This is just kind of to give you an overview of what the webinar is going to look like today, but more importantly, it's to provide kind of a table of contents or an index for you when you go back to these slides, or if you pass these slides on to someone on your staff who may be helping with the report. This outlines every key kind of concept that we're going to cover today during this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, some key due dates here. This is a really nice slide to actually print out and put at your desk, because what this does is outlines all of the reports on the left side, talks about their due dates in the middle, and highlights the focus of each report. And the one we're talking about today is highlighted. It's Module 2 of the Performance Data Form, which covers performance measures. And this looks at energy burden data and restoration and prevention data. So as Dan has mentioned in previous webinars, we've looked at the households you served, how you've spent the money, and this is really looking at the impacts of the program. How have you changed the conditions or the circumstances of the households that have come in for LIHEAP and been served? The due date for this report is at the end of January, and this is also when Module 1 is due, which is the grantee survey, and this looks at more fiscal components, and we went over this in another webinar. Next slide. As usual, we'd like to start with a poll. This helps us gauge where we're starting at the beginning of the webinar and how well the webinar worked to get you all more familiar with this report and what you need to do. So to begin, how prepared do you think your team is for completing the FY24 performance measures, or Module 2 of the Performance Data Form? Are you not at all prepared? You haven't turned attention to this. You're a little prepared. You're aware this is out there, but you really haven't planned yet. You're mostly prepared. You're already planning. Maybe you've already requested data from your vendors and you're starting to work things out. Or you're very prepared. You're already working on it. You get it, but you're here because you want to make sure and affirm your understanding, or maybe clarify a few things.
All right, we'll give the poll another 10 seconds.
All right, so it looks like we have a little bit of everything here today. Many of you are mostly prepared, and hopefully this will give you the clarification you need to move into the next category. For those of you who are not at all prepared or a little prepared, we're going to do our best to get you more informed, but as you'll hear several times through the webinar, we're here to help you even beyond this webinar. So please take advantage of a prize and their brilliant staff, and make sure to call and ask questions, especially if you're not finding out what you need to in today's webinar. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dan Bausch at Apprise.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to talk about the performance data form and how the performance measures fits into that report and what the purpose of the performance measures is. So if you were with us back in November, we had our first webinar on the performance data form, and that was focused on Module 1, which is the grantee survey, asking for fiscal information and average benefit and income cutoff information. Module 2 is the second part of the performance data form, and that's what we're focused on today. That collects information on developmental performance measures that the LIHEAP program began collecting back in 2016. Both of those modules are required. There's also a third optional performance measures module that you can voluntarily fill in if you choose to do so. So each of these Module 1 and Module 2 are distinct in what they're asking you to report, and the staff who work on them usually are not exactly the same, since Module 1 is more fiscal obligation information and Module 2 is program data and vendor data. All right, so we just bring up some images to jog everybody's memories about what these reports look like. So Module 1 is asking for the obligation information that's shown here. That's the grantee survey. Module 2 looks like this. It has a number of different fields where you have to report number values on things like income and the average main heating fuel bill. And there's several parts embedded within Module 2. And some of these items now are also collected on the quarterly report for a more condensed and defined time period of 3 months. And this is what the optional third module looks like if you've never looked at that. That collects extra information on average usage amounts and also things related to air conditioning. All right, so what is the purpose of the performance measures? Well, first, there's 3 different types of data that are collected in the performance data that are all really important for understanding the impacts of LIHEAP on low-income households. The first is energy burden targeting. That's in section 5. That's helping to understand what is the energy burden that LIHEAP recipient households are facing before they receive assistance, and how is that energy burden reduced or lowered because of LIHEAP assistance. Second part is understanding how LIHEAP helps restore energy service that's been lost due to running out of fuel or being disconnected from service. That gets reported in section 6. And then third, you're asked to also report information about how LIHEAP assistance helped prevent or stop someone from losing home energy service who was at imminent risk of losing it. That gets reported in section 7 of module 2. All of these are really important indicators for the program, and OCS and HHS are using this information to answer questions that come from the public, from the administration and Congress about LIHEAP. In 2020, the report was updated to collect additional information on supplemental funds, so the CARES funds first and then the ARPA funds. So module 2 was expanded to 2A, 2B, and 2C. For most of you, you've used up all of your CARES and ARPA funds in prior years, and those module 2B and 2C will not be applicable for you. But if you still have some remaining ARPA funds you've been providing to households during the prior fiscal year, 2024, you would need to report that information in module 2C. As I mentioned, this information is used. It is reported in the annual LIHEAP report to Congress. All the reports up through 2022 are now available and are published. It's published in the data warehouse, and it's used to respond to inquiries about the program. But beyond how HHS uses this information, it's really valuable for all of you and for program managers to be able to understand how energy burden is impacted by different groups, to understand how your benefit matrix or your benefit determination procedures are producing the burden results or the benefit distribution results that they are, and to be able to track progress over time, especially if you've made programmatic changes, seeing how that impacts restorations and preventions in energy burden. So for 2023, in the bottom blue box here, you can see some of the statistics on total restorations and total preventions that LIHEAP helped accomplish. So here's, if you've not looked at the data warehouse, that's where you can go find this information in somewhat of a raw form, but you can also get a summary version in the executive summaries that we've highlighted in some of the past webinars. You can go find yours. If you're not sure what this is, you can reach out to us and we can also send you it for your state. All right, so now we're going to talk about the 2024 reporting for Module 2 and what to expect. First is good news. There's no changes to the report that have been made from last year's report that was also due in January. The report looks the same layout, same format, same requirements as last year. One item to note that I mentioned earlier is you may have to report less than you did last year. If you had ARPA funds you were using last year or leftover CARES funds and you're no longer doing that, then you'll only have to fill out that first module 2A. So what this means is that the procedures and approaches that you did, if you're able to complete last year's report successfully and without major issues, you'd be able to use those same approaches to get the report done this year. As Akam mentioned, there was an action transmittal that was published yesterday. That action transmittal confirmed the due dates, January 31st for the 2024 performance data form. And it included the instructions for the performance data form, so for Module 1, Module 2, and optional Module 3. And the report has now been released in the OLDC system, so you should be able to navigate and find that, and there's more instructions on that later in the webinar today. As you all know, OLDC it can be a little bit challenging at times. So we encourage you to be able to go in and make sure you can see the report, to reach out to us or to the help desk if you're having OLDC challenges. But you have to remember that the report has to be submitted by a designated authorized official in the system, and to make sure that that person is aware of the report due date being January 31st. So we want to emphasize that the report's due at the end of January, and this report in particular asks you to pull together a lot of different information and go through a process of calculating different statistics to be able to report for Module 2. So it's important to plan ahead, and we've tried to develop different tools to help with that over the last several years. One of them that's in the handouts for this webinar in the little go-to webinar bar, this should be on your screen. One of them is called a Check Before You Submit document. I encourage you to grab that and use that to help you. Another one that we introduced last year was a spreadsheet that gives examples of how your data might look when you have it in a spreadsheet or you have it in your system, how you would then take that and use it to calculate statistics for the report. So we really recommend you share that with your staff that are doing the calculations, or your systems people, if you haven't before. Here's what that spreadsheet looks like. So the top here is example of what you might have in your data system or a spreadsheet after you put the data together. And then it goes through kind of a step-by-step process of how you would calculate each household's total energy bill and their energy burden, and then where that information gets put into Module 2. All right, so we thought what would be helpful for this training would be to have you hear from a peer about how they have gone through the process of collecting the energy expenditure data that you need for Module 2. That's how much each household was billed for their electricity usage or their main heating fuel usage. So we're going to hear from Brian Worrell from Pennsylvania about how Pennsylvania collects this data for Module 2.
Thank you, Dan. Hey, everybody. This is Brian from Pennsylvania. As Aiken said, I am the LIHEAP Policy Director for my state. I'm going to share a little bit about how we in Pennsylvania are going about the collection of the data from our energy vendors to complete the performance measures report. So since the performance measures report was launched, our state has worked on putting together a process for collecting the vendor data on an annual basis. It's now semi-automatic process. Wasn't always, now it is. With our data system doing some of the work, we have some staff who do work manually and in spreadsheets. And so I'm going to walk through the steps, but it's important to note that Pennsylvania is a state with a broad range of fuel types. We have 6 or 7 different types of fuel. So we collect data from a range of different vendors. Our recent results are shown here on the slide. Consistent with the requirements, we targeted our top vendors and have been able to obtain data from the top 5 or 6 electric and gas providers, the top 11 and 12 oil and propane vendors, and from a number of small wood and coal and other vendors. So we can go to the next slide. So how do we do this? Basically, the first thing we do is we identify the largest energy vendors. On our application, we do collect main heating type and their heating and electric vendor names. Using our recipient list for the fiscal year, in this case, federal fiscal year 2024, we tabulate those vendor names by fuel type, and then we can see how the top 5 or 10 vendors are for each fuel type. And it generally stays consistent over time, and we return to pretty much the same vendors year after year, especially when we're talking about the three biggest fuel types: electric, gas, and fuel oil. Step two, we create a spreadsheet to provide each vendor with a list of the recipient households that we are requesting the annual expenditure data for. We use our data system to generate files in a specified format, as you can see here. And those files include all recipients from the fiscal year who listed the vendor or for heating or electricity. An important note here is that it doesn't matter if our LIHEAP benefit was applied to that vendor. So we include, I mean, obviously this pretty much impacts electric vendors. We include a household in the electric vendor request list, even if the assistance went to the actual heating vendor, such as like a fuel oil vendor, for example. Next slide, please. So the third step is sending the vendor the data request. We maintain a contact list that we use each year. We have our established relationships with the vendors via their vendor agreements. We have a specific vendor unit that handles that contact and liaisoning between the state and the vendors. So once the vendors have the request as a part of this, they will then complete the request and send us the file back with the expenditure data. We have a centralized secure file transfer platform that the vendors have access to, and they can use that to submit the data by the deadline that we set. This is really important because we want to avoid using email at all costs so that we can have the information securely transferred. Next slide. So once the data gets to us, our team conducts a basic quality review of the vendor data. We want to make sure that it's the right file, obviously. We want to make sure it's fully complete, and we want to check to make sure that there are no obvious problems with the data. Account numbers are sort of matching what we're expecting and things like that, and formatting and things like that. And then the last step is to take the vendor data and match it to our program data. This is critical to determine which households have complete expenditure data and can be used in Section 5 of the report. And so for this step, we actually have someone familiar with the coding and data processing who is dedicated to completing this process each winter to make sure that we can get our report submitted time. And as you can see here on this slide, we actually do, in our vendor agreement, require that our vendors cooperate with the collection of this data. So it's not negotiable in terms of our vendor agreement. So next slide, please. So key takeaways. I hope the previous slides have all been useful, but number one, key takeaway: prioritize the largest vendors. This is a requirement for the report, and while it'd be great to collect it from additional vendors, it's important to focus on the main energy providers since they do provide service to the most households in our state. Number two, clearly establish your procedures and deadlines for collecting this data for your staff and your vendors. We know from personal experience how important it is that we get our data requests out early and that the vendors know what information they have to report back to us and by when. Number three, make incremental improvements. If there's a problem in your procedures, making a plan to address it the next year can really help. When we first started doing it, we had a lot of issues, and it's taken us a few years to get to where we are today, and have a pretty smooth process. Number four, remember that not all vendors are alike. I know pretty much all of you already know this, and know the challenges of working, especially with like deliverable fuel vendors, especially smaller deliverable fuel vendors when they have to provide data. They sometimes need phone calls and help in providing that data in a way that's easiest for them. So sometimes they need a little bit more handholding to get to the right information and get it collected. And then finally, documenting the approach is key. We want to make sure that things aren't lost, when somebody retires or, moves on to another position. It's important to have all the steps documented so that, it helps keep the process moving smoothly. And this can also go for, when interacting with the vendors as well on their side. You know, a lot of our vendors don't have high turnover, but those that do, it's always good because we have those relationships and have worked with them in the past to make sure that they can get the information in correctly and timely, like I said. So that's all that I have. Thank you very much for listening. I will turn it back over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Brian. So Brian's talking about the process of getting the data from the vendors, and that's really important for being able to complete Section 5. So we're going to talk about Section 5 next with the key reporting steps for energy burden targeting. So I've mentioned there's 3 sections in Module 2. So the first section is Section 5, which is energy burden targeting. There's a 3-step process to Section 5. You're computing and providing information on three different parts, 3 different groups that are all related. The first is Part A, is looking at the total number of bill payment assisted households in 2024. And that's a figure that you report in the household report as well, total households who got help with an energy bill. But in this report, you're asked to also provide that count by main heating type. Part B is filtering down to the subset of those households from which you got the energy expenditure data that Brian was just talking about from your top vendors. And then Part C, you're filtering down further to the households that have the highest energy burden based on being in the top 25%. And we're going to look at this in more detail to make it a little bit easier to follow. Section 5 does look confusing in spreadsheet form as it's shown here, but you can see the main thing we want to highlight here is the different sections. A is just a count of households. Section B, you're reporting 5 different pieces of information for each main fuel type that your households have. And then Section C, you're computing the same 5 pieces of information again for the high burden households. And then the report's going to auto calculate statistics on the gray lines related to the energy bill total, the energy burden, and the change in energy burden or the reduction in energy burden. So we're going to look at A, B, and C. So if we think about this as a pie, everyone you served in federal fiscal year 2024 to help with their energy bill, so you provided a heating benefit or a cooling benefit or a crisis bill payment assistance benefit, those all are used to calculate the number of households you served in FY24 for Part A of Section 5. So that's the blue pie shown here. Let's pretend you served 30,000 households in 2024. That would get put in Part A, as I mentioned. How about for Part B? As we go down to Part B, we're going to be looking at the households that you have the energy expenditure data from. For many of you, that involves going to the energy vendors and getting this information back from them. And you're going to have some households where you have the information and some households where you don't. So Part B is always going to be a subset of Part A. In this example, we're going to imagine that you got data back for 20,000 out of the 30,000. For just those 20,000, you're going to compute different statistics like the average annual income, total LIHEAP benefit, and the main heating bill as shown here. As part of the report, once you've put together the households for Part B, for every one of those households, you have to calculate their energy burden percentage based on their energy bills and their income. Once you have that, you have to identify the highest burden households that are the top 25% of the households in Part B. Those households get used for Part C of the report shown in orange here, and they're going to be used when you recalculate all the statistics again on annual income, main heating bill, and so forth. So in this example, again, if we had 20,000 households that we had the energy expenditure data for, the top 25%, so 20,000 times 25% would be 5,000. So you'd be recalculating the statistics for just those 5,000 that have the highest energy burdens. That allows you to have a comparison between the assistance the highest burden households are receiving and the average assistance that all households are receiving. So what do you need to be able to include a household in Part B and in Part C? Well, you need either 4 or 5 pieces of information for each household. On this slide, the items in orange are information that you should have in your program data that you collect from your application or you have in your program records. So most of you, the main heating fuel type is going to be a field on your application. Annual household income is going to be something that you have recorded for each household that you need to determine their income eligibility and their benefit amount. And the total LIHEAP benefits received is also going to come from your program records. So those 3 are pieces of information you should have. The items in blue are what you'd be collecting from your energy vendors. That's the annual main heating expenditures or the annual electricity expenditures. If a household's main heating is something other than electric, you still need their electricity expenditures to include them in Section 5, Part B. So this is really handy to just make sure you know what you need, and your staff working on the report know what pieces of information you need to connect. For identifying the high burden in Part C, we want to emphasize that for this report, we're asking everyone is asked to use the same definition for defining a household as being a high burden. In this case, it's just a calculation, an identification of which households are in the top 25% or the top quartile of the households that you have the information for in Part B. And there's 6 steps laid out on this slide in how you would identify those high burden households. And we also have a slide showing this visually, and we'll go to that next. So these slides relate. This slide shows it a little bit more in a spreadsheet form. Let's imagine that you have a group of households like the household shown on this slide. You've collected, put together their information on their main heating fuel, their income. The first step is you need to figure out their total residential energy bill. If a household has electric main heat, you've collected their electric bill from their energy vendor, then that's going to be their total energy bill. But if a household is, like household 2 here, is heating with fuel oil, you would need their fuel oil bill amount and their electricity amount to understand and calculate their full residential energy burden. You calculate that total energy bill. Then step 2 is you're calculating in this last column all the way on the right, their energy burden based on their annual income and their total residential energy bill. When you calculate that for each household, you may have households that receive assistance that have 0 income, and you need to assign them as having 100% energy burden for the report. Once you've done this, step 4 is you sort the households from highest burden to lowest burden. Then you're able to select the top 25%. So if you have 100 households, then you'd be selecting the first 25 as high burden. There's other approaches to doing this, but this is really helpful to just get the basics down and the concept down. right, now we're going to look at the next section. This is section 6. This is the restoration of lost service on module 2. So now we're moving from section 5 to section 6. Section 6 is all about occurrences where LIHEAP helped someone who no longer had energy service. So they had lost their electricity, they'd lost their ability to use their heating system, run out of fuel, their heating system was broken, and a LIHEAP grant or LIHEAP assistance was provided that restored their service. For many of you, you have this information available from your crisis assistance records, and a lot of this can correspond to your crisis assistance. But it's important to note that some of it there may be households that you're assisting with outside of your traditional crisis components that could fit into these categories. So it's important to know how your program's structured to make sure you count all restoration occurrences in section 6. Whereas the household report or section 5 are kind of focused on households, this section is asking about occurrences or instances. So you may have a situation where someone, they were disconnected for one fuel, and maybe for their another fuel, their equipment broke. You can count the same household multiple times if they had a restoration occurrence more than once in FY24. You are asked to break these down by the fuel type where the benefit was applied. So this doesn't correspond to the main heating fuel type. For example, if a propane heating household had their electricity disconnected and you provided a benefit that reconnected them to their electricity, you would report them on line 1, energy service restored after disconnection, in that electricity column. Even though their main heating type wasn't electricity, that's where they were restored. So the simple steps to try to complete this section are to identify all the benefits that you provided in 2024 and to use information from your application or your program records about which of those benefits was provided to a household that had lost energy service. And many of you, those three rows at the bottom here are items that come from your application that are asked. Are you disconnected currently? Have you run out of fuel? Are you near running out of fuel? Is your equipment non-functional? If you have further questions, definitely reach out to us so we can help, because it does vary by program, but we just want to emphasize that those tend to come from the application or from your program records. So here's some good examples of restoration instances: disconnections, households without a delivered fuel who got a payment or a fuel delivery, or inoperable non-working equipment that got repaired or replaced with LIHEAP federal funds. And there is a supplement that if you download the slides here, you can click on this, click on the blue, and you'll be able to go to a document that helps kind of define what counts as restorations. All right, and then the last section is section 7, and that's the prevention of the loss of service. So we're going to look at that next. I'm going to move down to section 7. So section 7 is similar to section 6, but the big difference is that this is focused on LIHEAP assistance that stopped an imminent loss of service. And for many of you, this may correspond with your crisis assistance, but there may be assistance you're providing with your regular heating assistance, your regular cooling assistance, where households receive that at the point that they are not yet disconnected or without energy service. They may be getting assistance through your regular components. So it's important to identify which kinds of households that are in these situations, what kind of assistance they would receive, and to make sure you're counting the correct number of households in this report. As with section 6, we're talking about occurrences here, so that's instances that this may have happened, and it's very common that a household may have gotten, if you have a year-round program especially, may have gotten assisted more than once at the point that they were receiving late notices and were going to be disconnected, or that they ran out of fuel more than once. So you're reporting instances, not households. This information for these 3 rows in this section, you may be collecting this on your application. You may also be collecting it through your program records and your interaction with your vendors. So we encourage you to look and make sure you know where these items would come from. If everybody automatically gets a certain type of assistance because they have a disconnect notice, right away they go to a certain crisis component, for example, then you have an easy way to count it. But if that's not so clear, you might have to look and make sure that you have connected all the dots from your different components. So that's section 7, the prevention. For the examples, most common are households with a disconnect notice that received a LIHEAP benefit that was applied to the account. The household was low on a delivered fuel and the LIHEAP benefit provided that fuel. Or they had equipment that wasn't working well but was still functional, and your heating equipment repair and replace program, weatherization program replaced or fixed that equipment so it was then operable without issues. One really important note here is that each of you has, it's not defined by HHS what constitutes an imminent loss of service. So there's examples in this supplement of what that may be, but that's something that's to be defined by each grant recipient in terms of how to report households that were prevented from the imminent loss. So there's common definitions like a household has 20% of their fuel remaining or less. Household received a disconnect notice, indicating they would be disconnected soon. Different definitions like that. All right. Now we're going to move on to guidance for Module 2C. This is just for those of you who may still have ARPA funds that you were expending to provide benefits during FY24. So with Module 2C, what you're asked to do is, if you did use ARPA funds to provide benefits, you need to be able to identify the households that received assistance with ARPA funds, to isolate those households in a data set, and to calculate all the same statistics that you used for Module 2A. With doing that, we've helped states with different approaches on how to do this. But what's important is that this doesn't have to be a household was only assisted with ARPA. If a household received any portion of their benefits that they received in 2024 were with those supplemental ARPA funds, you would want to count them in Module 2C. And you don't have to go through a separate process of trying to collect vendor data for just this group. You would include those households that were assisted with ARPA and who you collected the energy expenditure data from already through the main request. So if you're thinking this is going to double the work, it shouldn't double your work, but it does require that extra step of filtering down and being able to identify which households received the ARPA assistance. For Module 2C, the energy burden data, here's what this would look like visually. Again, looking at kind of a pie example, all households that got any assistance with ARPA dollars are this brown pie here. Let's imagine that's 20,000 households. Part B would be the households that you got the energy expenditure data for, which you have to collect anyway for the main module. So in this case, we're imagining 10,000 households had that information. You'd calculate their income, their main heating bill, and then one difference is that instead of the entire LIHEAP benefit amount they got, you'd be just calculating their average ARPA benefit amount. In this example, it's $200. And then lastly, the high burden households would be the top 25%, shown in the red here. And for those, you'd calculate all the statistics again, focused on the ARPA benefit amounts. So what you need for Module 2C, if you did use ARPA funds again, is you need the ARPA benefit amount, and you need to know which household received assistance with the ARPA supplemental funds. We didn't talk about Module 2B, which is the CARES module, but the same principles that you see here for Module 2C apply to Module 2B if you still had remaining CARES funds you were using. For the restoration and prevention sections, it's the same type of approach where you're focusing in on instances where a household was assisted with some amount of ARPA funds, and the household either had service restored or imminent loss of service prevented. You'd be filtering and counting those households in Module 2C, sections 6 and 7. Here is a helpful cheat sheet we made. It can be confusing with the sections in different parts, but this talks about each different type of item throughout Module 2, and what is needed and what the population group is for each of those households. So we recommend you save this and keep it with you as you're preparing the report. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Melissa, who's going to give us our final reminders.
Thanks, Dan. So just a reminder about the due date and the process. This report is due on January 31st of next year. And OCS has released the report in the Online Data Collection System, or OLDC. Remember that when you submit this report, it needs to be validated and certified by a designated authorized official. So this can take some time. If you need technical assistance in completing the report, and that includes any step. So if you have not gotten to request data from your vendors yet and you need some assistance with any piece of that, identifying which vendors you should be reaching out to, putting together a template to send them, or putting together a template to request their data back, checking the data when it comes back, merging that data with your system data, any of those steps, we really encourage you to contact us as soon as possible so we can help you. We have gotten on the phone with vendors before. We've worked directly with them. We've helped states to process their data. Don't wait until the report is due or you're pulling your hair out the week before to try and get it done. Reach out as soon as you can and we can help you. So as Dan mentioned, there are no changes to the performance measures report from last year's report. It has the same layout and lines and requirements. The one thing he did note is that for most of you, modules 2B and 2C, the CARES and ARPA modules, are not applicable because many of you exhausted these funds. But if you did expend remaining ARPA or CARES funds in FY24, you should complete these submodules. Next slide. So we've included in this slide deck some DC resources, and now many of you are getting geared up to submit other reports, and so you're familiar with Grant Solutions and OLDC, but we do know that in some offices different staff and different groups submit different reports, and so it's important for you to take some time to go get logged in, make sure your login information and credentials are up to date. Once you are logged in, you'll go to OLDC in the top taskbar to access the homepage with these reports available. Now, if you need assistance, we encourage you to call the help desk directly. We've included contact information here. If you're having problems getting through to Grant Solutions or they're just not able to help you with what you need, you can feel free to reach out to your liaison or to us at Apprise, and we'll try and help you further. The submission process, for those of you who might not be familiar, is multi-step. So you'll need to submit your form in the system. The individuals who have permission to certify and submit may vary based on how you've set up your account. The grant administrator should be able to perform all actions by default, but this is once again a good reason to go in and take a look, make sure your credentials are up to date, make sure you know who can submit and certify. To submit the form, you'll need to enter and save your report. You'll need to validate it. Once the form is valid and correct, you'll need to certify and submit it. Now, there's some validation steps, which I think we're going to talk about on the next slide. Once you enter your data, there are some checks built in, and so you may see either warning or fatal error messages. Now, the warning messages are like speed bumps. So they're going to say, look, this data might be correct, but we want you to confirm it because maybe it's way different than last year. Maybe it's something that we wouldn't expect to see. And so what we want you to do is check it. Anytime you get a warning message, it should trigger you to leave an explanation in the notes section, even if it makes perfect sense to you, because what will happen is once you submit your report, Apprise will double check and validate, and they will reach out to ask you questions. But if you have notes explaining why there may be an anomaly or something, you know, that's a little off or different, they won't need to follow up with you. Fatal error messages are like those things, if you want to go back, are like those things at the rental car places where if you run them over, your tires will go flat, that you cannot move on from these. These indicate inconsistent data. They're things that are arithmetically impossible. We know them to be typos, and you have to fix them before you can submit. Now, if you get a warning or a fatal error message and you're like, oh, I know this is right, or I don't understand why this is coming up and I don't know how to fix it, please reach out to us and we'll help you get through that. Next slide. So once you submit your report, as I mentioned, Apprise will email you if they have any issues or questions based on the review. Grant recipients, that's you all, should provide a response and make corrections to the report. If you aren't clear about what Apprise is saying, or you're just not sure how to fix it, once again, please reach out. We'll walk you through that. Don't wait to respond until you try to figure it out. Just give us a call. We can talk through it. When Apprise confirms the report is complete, that's when your liaison will accept it in OLDC. And if you later identify a correction or a change, you know, you realize you forgot some data or, you know, something isn't quite right, you would need to submit a revision in OLDC. Next slide. Both Dan and I, as well as Brian, mentioned that there are lots of resources available that can help you, and we've included links to all of these here, as well as I believe there's some of these in the handout section, like the check before you submit document. There's a PDF, but all these are linked. This includes the instructions, forms, so you can actually go in and fill out a form before you put it in OLDC, required report support. The check before you submit document is fabulous. And then for those of you who are brand new, it really does help to kind of get grounded and understand what your previous year's data looked like. I help a few states with their data, and every year I go back and compare the numbers to what we submitted in previous years just to make sure we're not way off. And so this can be really useful, and you can go on and look at the data warehouse to get that information. We do have another upcoming training webinar. I believe it will complete our circuit of webinars for reporting training, and this is going to be next week, December 17th, and it's about completing the FY2025 LIHEAP quarterly reports. And so we encourage you to come along and invite anyone else who might learn from this. And with that, we have a second poll. This will be followed, by the way, by contact information as well as questions. But now we kind of want to do a post check. How helpful was this webinar in understanding what is needed to complete the 24 performance measures? Not 24 performance measures, FY24 performance measures. Was this not at all helpful, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful? In addition to this poll, if you have any feedback that would make these webinars or trainings more meaningful to you, easier to understand, or cover questions that maybe you didn't get answered, we welcome them. You can email any of us or talk to your liaison.
And while we have the poll, we do have a question. I think we can start answering them. So from the review of section 5, it seems we would want to exclude households that we do not have 12-month consecutive history for. Is this correct?
Yes, yeah, that roughly is correct. So part A, again, is just the count of households that got any kind of bill payment assistance. So that's everyone. But then part B is just those that you have their full expenditure amount. And to try to compare apples to apples, what you're asked to do is, if a household has electricity as their main heating source, you would have to have the data from their electric vendor, their expenditure amount for a 12-month period. Then that household gets included. If you have a household that their main heating is with natural gas, you need both. You need their full expenditure amount for natural gas and for electricity, since they're heating with gas, but they of course use electricity as well. We need both of those expenditure amounts for households that use a delivered fuel or use natural gas, to make sure the comparison's apples to apples. So for many states, the amount of households that they get the energy vendor data from is definitely going to be a subset. And as kind of Brian indicated, it's okay for it to be a subset and make incremental improvements over time. But if by targeting the largest vendors, you are able to collect data for a good portion of your households. So that's always something that we also will look at. And if you need help like strategizing on how to target vendors, definitely reach out to us.
Well, it looks like this was helpful for many of you, and we're happy to hear that. If you have additional questions as you are working on the report, please reach out to us. We welcome that. We've put all of our contact information here, including your liaisons and your peers. Some folks in this network have been doing this a really long time, and so if you need ideas or want to talk to them, we also encourage you to reach out to your colleagues. All of our information is listed here, and we encourage you to give us a call or shoot us an email.
We do have one more quick question. So if a household received assistance more than once, what income information should be reported in the report?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you're assisting households more than once during the federal fiscal year, and there's a change, like a change in income or a change in something in the household characteristics, but mainly for this report for income, what you're asked to do is have kind of a process or a decision for picking one of those values. and using one of them. You don't want to use both of them. You just want to use one because we're counting the households only once in Part B and Part C. Many states, we usually will use the earlier income amount, but as long as you have a process for picking one, that's acceptable. All right, well, as Melissa said, we have another webinar next week on the quarterly reports, and we appreciate your time. If you have additional questions, reach out to us, and we'll also follow up with any of you that submitted any other questions. So thank you for your time today, and look forward to seeing you next week.